Good afternoon. It's my very special pleasure and honor to welcome you tonight to a launch of Queer Migration and Asylum in Europe, a new UCL Press edited volume edited by Richard C.M, Professor of Political Sociology at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. I very much look forward to hearing from Richard and also from 4 of his contributors about this fascinating book and collection of perspectives and sites and life experiences represented in it. Richard and our presenters also very much want to hear from you, our attendees, and you'll have the chance to ask questions throughout in the chat or Q&A or in person later on in this event. We are recording this event and we'll be putting it up on our YouTube channel. My name is Claudia Steinbeck. I'm head of academic programming at the UCL European Institute. And the book we're here to celebrate today is one result of a project strand that Richard has led under the European Institute's program as a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence funded by the European Commission on LGBTQ migration and asylum in Europe. Now, our contribution to this was rather prosaic, and all credit really goes to Richard. In an effort to build lasting networks and shape research agendas, he has convened 3 events under this project strand. First, in May 2017, an academic multidisciplinary workshop. And in December of that year, 2017, an international conference. And on the project page, the link to which I'll be putting in the chat later, you'll find a series of really interesting 1-minute interviews with presenters at that conference. The third event then was a research to policy workshop held in May 2019, which brought together researchers with activists and policymakers who have hands-on experience of working with LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers. Now, the latest output of Richard's program under this Center of Excellence is the book we're launching today. Many congratulations, Richard. Congratulations to the contributors, and over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Claudia. So I'm going to share my screen as well. So just by way of introduction, I just wanted to sort of say a little bit about what motivated us to sort of come together and put this book together. And the main motivation was really the difficult situation facing LGBT people in countries throughout the world. As of December last year, there are still 67 UN member states which criminalize homosexuality, with 6 imposing the death penalty on same-sex sexual acts. There's a further 42 member states who've introduced laws limiting freedom of expression regarding LGBT issues, including the well-known gay propaganda laws in Russia. But even in states where homosexuality is not a crime, LGBT people often face marginalization, discrimination, hostility, and violence. And therefore, it's probably no surprise that LGBT people often seek to migrate to or claim asylum in other countries. In this context, Europe is a popular destination. The EU has done a lot, or sort of broader European institutions have done a lot to promote LGBT equality, and a number of European states take great pride in their tolerance of sexual diversity. However, the image of European tolerance and the reality faced by LGBT migrants and asylum seekers is unfortunately often sort of quite conflicting. Even if they do not, so LGBT asylum seekers long hoped for escape from persecution inevitably comes into conflict, often with sort of attempts by legal and political institutions to keep them out. Even if they do not migrate specifically in order to escape persecution, LGBT migrants often find that Europe is not as welcoming as they were led to believe. And they may find themselves marginalized, both as ethnic minorities in the destination society and also as queer individuals within the ethno-diasporic communities. And so this is what brought us together. We're a group of academics representing different academic disciplines: politics, sociology, anthropology, and law. And the various contributions of our book seek to engage with sort of various questions. Why do LGBT people migrate or seek asylum in the first place? To what extent do they engage with their ethno-national diasporic communities? To what extent do they renegotiate their identities in contexts of dispersal? What role do European institutions play in facilitating or restricting queer migration and asylum? And what are the legal, social, and political frameworks that queer migrants and refugees need to navigate in order to regularize their status within the destination societies? So today we're going to be hearing from representatives of 4 of the chapters, 5 sort of presenters. We're just going to give quite short presentations, just sort of 15 minutes, to give you a sort of a taste of the book, but hopefully we'll sort of whet your appetite enough that you will go to the UCL Press website and download the free open access copy. So you can do that at the uclpress.co.uk website, just search for the book. If you would rather have a physical copy, you can get a 20% discount until the end of August if you insert that code. So thank you. So now I will hand back to Claudia, who will introduce the first speaker.
Our first speaker is Robert Wintermute, who will start us off by giving us a legal perspective. His chapter explores same-sex partner immigration in Europe under the title Universal Humanities versus National Citizenship. A specialist in human rights law, anti-discrimination law, and sexual orientation law, Robert is Professor of Human Rights Law at King's College London. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I thought a good way to start would be just to read the first paragraph of my chapter, which sets the stage for the book fairly concisely. So I'll just do that now. Now, if I can find the right page. Okay. Sorry, here we are. To a lesbian, gay, or bisexual person in Asia, Africa, or the Caribbean who sees no hope of legal or social progress in their country in the near future, traveling to Europe to claim asylum might seem their best option. But how to get there? European governments rarely, if ever, issue asylum seeker visas to people who are still in their own country. Without a visa, they cannot board a flight out of their country. They could apply for a visa for a conference, internship, or summer school, if they have a sponsor, or for a tourist visa, if they have enough money, and conceal their plan to claim asylum. Or they could pay people smugglers to get them on a boat across the Mediterranean and risk drowning. Is there another safer option? In November 2013, I spoke at a seminar in Dhaka about the Yogyakarta principles and how they might be used in the struggle for LGBT equality in Bangladesh. A question from one of the male participants surprised me. How can I find a boyfriend in the United Kingdom? Although I wanted him to be inspired by the Yogyakarta principles to stay at home and work for a better future for LGBT persons in his country, he had identified a much quicker route to equality. Okay, so what I'm going to discuss in the remainder of my presentation is essentially recognition of same-sex partners in immigration law and the recent case law of the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union. But before I do that, I just thought I might mention a little bit of history. Having watched It's a Sin about the 1980s recently, it made me think, well, what was same-sex partner immigration like back then? So I could dedicate my presentation to my late friend, a dear friend, Felix Tovar from Venezuela, whom I knew when we were both living in New York in the 1980s, and there was no such thing as same-sex partner immigration. So at one point, he had a lesbian friend, they were working together, and he said, would you like to share an apartment? And she said, yes. And he said, and while we're at it, would you mind getting married? So he married her, And that's how he got his green card and permanent residence in the US. That was the only possibility. And I know two couples in London who had to do the same thing in the 1980s or 90s. So if you go back in time and ask when did the law start to change for same-sex couples in the UK, the first significant step, or first reform really was same-sex partner immigration in October 1997. So the new Labour government had come in May, and they could change the immigration rules without an act of parliament, and they did so. So basically, everything that follows, well, the other countries in Europe had done it before the UK. We were definitely not the leaders, but the trend across Europe was eventually reflected in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the EU. So let's start with the European Court of Human Rights. Way back in 2003, I received an email from an NGO in Italy, Arci Gay, about a couple living in New Zealand. Douglas McCall was a citizen of New Zealand and Roberto Tadeucci, a citizen of Italy. And they were hoping to move back to Italy. And they expected that they would have trouble getting a residence permit. So actually, in an exchange of emails in 2003, we mapped out the whole strategy. Move back to Italy, apply for a residence permit. It will probably be refused. Then you go to the Italian courts, you will probably lose. And then we'll go to the European Court of Human Rights. And that process took about 6 years. So in 2009, they lost in the in the Corte di Cassazione, the highest civil court in Italy. And at that point, it became illegal for Douglas McCall to live in Italy. He had to leave the country. So they fled essentially to Amsterdam or to the Netherlands. At one point, there was a group in the Netherlands called Love Exiles, involving couples in a similar situation. So the Netherlands was very welcoming based on their relationship as a cohabiting couple with no registration certificate. They couldn't get one in New Zealand at the time. They couldn't get one in Italy. They were recognized. Mr. McCall was given a residence permit, and that solved their problem. In 2010, they got married in Amsterdam. But they had the case ongoing at the European Court of Human Rights. I was their lawyer. It took a long time, but eventually we won in June 2016. And it established an important principle that applies to 47 countries. So in terms of the case law of the court, how it developed, the first step in 2003, the court said that a same-sex couple had to be given the same rights as an unmarried opposite-sex couple. Then in 2010, the court said, yes, the same-sex couple enjoys family life. That was another important step under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Then by 2016, they applied that principle in the context of immigration in a case from Croatia. Croatia would give a residence permit to an unmarried opposite-sex partner, but not a same-sex partner. But so the legal challenge in Tadeucci and McCall was that Italy said, and the highest court found, that there was no discrimination. They said, we treat unmarried opposite-sex couples in the same way. We treat same-sex couples in the same way as unmarried opposite-sex couples. Neither group can qualify for a residence permit. So we had to argue in the European Court of Human Rights for a new approach. Well, sorry, it wasn't really a new approach. It was taking a principle from the year 2000 and applying it to a new situation. So in 2000, in the case of Flaminos versus Greece, involving a man who's a Jehovah's Witness, the court said for the first time that sometimes governments must treat people who are in different situations differently. And so that approach was applied in this case. The court said, Mr. Tadeucci and Mr. McCall cannot get married in Italy. they cannot solve their immigration problem. They're in a different situation from an unmarried opposite-sex couple. Therefore, they must be treated differently. So the court said Italy had to find some way for them to qualify for a residence permit. And because of a quirk of timing, Italy actually complied with the judgment 6 weeks before the judgment came out. That was because in another case, the court decided that Italy had to have a specific legal framework for same-sex couples. And that was 2015, and May 2016, Italy complied by passing a law on civil unions. So since 2016, any couple in the same situation can enter a civil union, and the Italian citizen can sponsor the non-EU citizen for residence. So now that, as I said, that applies to 47 countries, and the next step is to extend it to some Eastern European countries. And this takes me to European Union law and Romania. So back in 2011, I was at the ILGA Europe conference in Torino in Italy, and re-met Adrian Coman, an activist from Romania, who was working for the European Parliament in Brussels at the time. And he told me that the year before he got married to a man from the US, Clay Hamilton. And I said to him, well, you have a perfect test case. So what you need to do is apply for a residence permit for Clay. It will probably be refused. Then you go to the Romanian courts and you ask them to refer a question to the Court of Justice of the European Union. Now, what is the question? The freedom of movement of EU citizens and their family members is governed by a directive from 2004, number 38. And it allows the EU citizen, when they go to another member state, or when they potentially when they return, oh, that's a technical issue, to be accompanied by their spouse. And when this directive was adopted in 2004, spouse was deliberately left undefined. The European Parliament wanted it to say clearly opposite sex or same sex. The Council, which consists of the member state governments, they didn't want anything so explicit. And so it was decided just to leave it undefined, and it would be up to the Court of Justice to decide. So finally, in June 2018, sorry, from the time of the conference in October 2011 till November 2017, that was over 6 years, a hearing took place in the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg, the case having been referred by the Constitutional Court of Romania. And in June 2018, the judgment came out and the court found in favor of Adrian Coman. They said spouse includes a same-sex spouse, and that he was entitled to sponsor Clay Hamilton, and Clay Hamilton is entitled to a residence permit in Romania. So a big victory. This was the 5th of June, 2018. On the following Saturday, the 9th of June, I was in Bucharest, and I went to Bucharest Pride and celebrated this great step forward, great victory with Adrian and Clay. So that's June 2018. August 2020, I'm working on a study for the European Parliament on free movement of rainbow families in the European Union. And I decided to email the NGO Accept in Bucharest that supported the Coman and Hamilton case, and just ask them a little detail. So Mr. Hamilton's residence permit, what does it say? Does it say spouse? Does it say partner? Does it say family member? And to my great surprise, the answer came back, the residence permit hasn't been issued yet. And so now we're over 2.5 years since the judgment. Romania has not complied, and they have recently taken their case to the European Court of Human Rights, which is very embarrassing for the EU legal system. I would hope that very soon there will be an enforcement action, or what they call infringement proceedings, Commission versus Romania, but that hasn't happened yet. I think I'll close very briefly by just saying a few words about asylum, as I don't think we have a legal expert on asylum who's going to speak. As I said, a big problem is that European countries, all affluent countries, are very hypocritical about asylum. They say, yes, if you get, we want to protect you from persecution, and we will definitely offer you asylum. We'll give you refugee status if you can get here. Okay, and that's a big if. And we have judgments of both the Court of Justice of the EU and the Court of Human Rights saying that Belgium did not have to grant visas to a Syrian family in Lebanon that was trying to get to Europe. So yeah, so that's the number one problem with LGB asylum or any other form of asylum, physically getting to Europe without dying in the process. Once you get here, then you have two big legal problems. If you have a well-founded fear of persecution or something similar under the European Convention on Human Rights, say there's a real risk of usually physical violence, then you have a right to stay here. But the two questions that come up are, one, how likely is it that this will happen in your country of origin? And two, how do we know you're really lesbian, gay, bisexual? So this makes this area of law very, very challenging. And to date, we have very little, we don't have much, we don't really have positive decisions from the European Court of Human Rights. A recent statement that you don't have to conceal your sexual orientation, which follows the Court of Justice of the European Union. There are more positive decisions from the Court of Justice, but one thing to note is the Court of Justice doesn't actually grant asylum. It interprets EU law, it sends general principles back to national courts, and they apply them. Whereas the Court of Human Rights is very hesitant, because usually the context of the case is that someone is facing deportation, and they have to decide, if you deport this person, will that violate the European Convention? If they say yes, that means the person must be allowed to remain. And so they are very hesitant. To my knowledge, to date, they have not, in a single case, said, yes, you must grant them a right to remain in Europe. Okay, I think I've used my time. So I look forward to questions and comments later. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Richard Mcneal himself, who will take us to Berlin and the queer Polish, Brazilian and Russian diasporas there. As I said, he's professor of political sociology at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and his research focuses on the relationship between identity and power, and more specifically with reference to nationalism, sexualities and migration. Richard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, so my interest in the sort of the broader themes of the book is sort of what happens to sort of queer migrants when they arrive in the destination society. Is it important for them to sort of maintain their identities, their language, their culture? And if so, how do they do that? Do they do that in the traditional way of most migrants by sort of engaging with the existing diaspora community? So just to sort of explain very briefly what I mean by diaspora. So I'm using it to mean, in the sort of the general sense, a sort of a dispersed community that sort of maintains a sense of homeland orientation, by which I mean that to some extent the identity of the community is related to the original homeland, and also maintains a boundary maintenance. So it's not completely assimilated in the host society. There is still an element of a separate identity. And when I'm referring to queer diaspora, I'm using it in the sense that Anne-Marie Fortier uses it to mean sort of the queering of the ethnic diaspora. So establishing queer spaces within the ethnically defined diasporas in order to challenge some of the heterosexist norms supporting definitions of ethnic diasporas. So diasporas can play a very sort of important role in facilitating cross-border migration to begin with, and in particular in the subsequent integration within the destination society. They can offer migrants social, economic and psychological support and help maintain their national identities. At the same time, however, if diasporic communities enforce boundary maintenance too rigidly or insist on strictly maintaining cultural norms from the homeland, then they can impede rather than facilitate integration into the new society. Also, they risk alienating potential members of the diaspora who choose not to conform to the sort of the very traditional and desired conceptualization of the shared identity. And this is often a sort of a particular challenge for queer migrants. However, queer migrants' unwillingness or inability to engage with the diasporic communities does sort of run the risk of their being marginalized as ethnic communities within the destination society, but also as sexual minorities within the ethnic diaspora. So this sort of shows that there's no sort of a priori relationship between migrants and their diasporic communities, and also that there are sort of, in particular for sort of queer migrants, there are different sort of modalities and outcomes of diaspora engagement. And so I wanted to sort of look at that within the specific context of Berlin by looking at three of the sort of larger diasporic communities, the Poles, the Brazilians, and the Russians. And so my research was based on sort of 60 interviews and also with a survey of sort of over 500 respondents. It was a multi-sited project. I sort of looked at Berlin and then sort of replicated the project in London, but today I'll just sort of focus on the Berlin outcomes. And so the first thing that was immediately apparent by sort of analysing the data from the queer Poles, Brazilians and Russians was that sort of the desire to engage with the ethnic diaspora was much weaker among the Poles than it was among the Brazilians, despite the fact that the Poles said that, you know, maintaining their cultural identity and their language was very important, just as important as the other two communities said. So the first question I was sort of interested in was why was sort of ethnic diasporic consciousness sort of weaker among the queer Poles in Berlin compared with the Brazilians and with the Russians. And in general, the reasons they gave would sort of apply to sort of all sort of potential migrants, not specifically sort of queer migrants. And so the main factor seemed to be geographic proximity. Given sort of where Poland is in relation to Germany, it's sort of very easy for sort of Polish migrants to sort of travel back and forth quite easily to the ethnic homeland, something that isn't as easy to do if you're Russian and in particular if you're Brazilian. And so this was sort of something I sort of heard repeatedly. So as Henrik said, you know, if I miss something Polish, I go to Poland. I don't need to find it in Berlin. If I lived in California, it would be different, but I don't. I live in Berlin. And it was the case that of the Poles I spoke to in Germany, almost a quarter of them went back to Poland once a month, whereas only sort of 3% of the Poles I spoke to in the UK did the same. And indeed, for certain, for certain of my respondents, so for example, one of them lived in Stettin, sort of up here, which is sort of very close to, you know, which is much nearer to Berlin than a large number of sort of Berlin cities. And so he lived sort of quite a sort of a transnational existence. So he said, you know, he would sort of work in Szczecin, but then he would sort of come to sort of Berlin practically every weekend. So he sort of didn't need to engage with the diaspora to maintain a sense of Polish community. Also, again, because sort of both countries are in Schengen and are sort of very close geographically, it was sort of very easy for sort of Poles to sort of come to sort of Germany, test it out first, see whether they wanted to live there, could they find a job, could they find somewhere to live. So they didn't sort of need to rely on the diaspora community to such an extent as others. And also a lot of them spoke very good German. I did more interviews with the Poles in German than was the case with the Brazilians and the Russians. So in general, the reasons that they chose not to engage with the Polish diaspora had sort of little to do with their sexuality, although some did say that they had made sort of tentative attempts to sort of engage with Polonia in Berlin, but they found that most of the people who did want to sort of engage were sort of young mums with kids, and also it was often sort of centered around sort of the religious community, the Polish churches. And so in general, there was sort of much less desire on the part of the queer Poles I spoke to sort of engage with other Poles in general in Berlin, or to sort of even go to sort of Polish shops or restaurants. So only 6% of the respondents had visited a Polish venue, compared with almost 30% in London. Now, when it came to the Brazilians and the Russians, given the sort of the perceived sort of reverse sort of inverse relationship between sort of diasporic engagement and geographic proximity, both the Brazilians and the Russians said that they were sort of keen to sort of engage with other Brazilians and Russians, particularly as a means to sort of maintain their identity and their language in particular. And yet, while both the Brazilians and the Russians did want to sort of seek out other Brazilians and Russians, the way that they engaged with their sort of diasporic communities was sort of quite different. And this related primarily to the sort of the nature of the Russian and the Brazilian communities in Berlin. So the Brazilians were much more likely to engage with the existing ethno-national Brazilian diaspora than was the case with the Russians. And this related primarily to the fact that compared with the Russian community, which had a long history in Berlin, or a long history in Germany, which was very large, there was sort of 1.3 million migrants from Russia living in Germany, and that's sort of without sort of bringing in those from the other sort of Russian speakers from the other sort of republics. Whereas the Brazilian community was much smaller. It was sort of, there's less than 100,000 Brazilians in Germany at all. And also, while the migration was quite recent, the biggest waves were in the sort of the 90s, when the Brazilians was trying to sort of escape the economic downturn in Brazil. But it wasn't just sort of economic migrants; it was also sort of young sort of artists, sort of DJs, sort of filmmakers, and so this sort of young. And also sort of a lot of sort of queer Brazilians were sort of among these sort of waves of sort of migration. And it meant that they were able to sort of co-constitute what it meant to be sort of Brazilian in the sort of the migration context in a way that sort of wasn't the case, as we'll see, with sort of the Russians. What it meant to be sort of Russian in Germany had sort of already been sort of well established by the sort of the very traditional communities that had sort of been part of the various waves for sort of decades. And so the sort of the impression that I got from the sort of the Brazilians that I spoke to was that the sort of the Brazilian community, the Brazilian diaspora community, was sort of they found it to be sort of much more open than sort of some of the other sort of diaspora communities in Germany. So Camilo sort of said that, you know, he likes to hang out with Brazilians in general. And he said, you know, the Brazilians who sort of come to Berlin, they're a very specific type of crowd, you know, they're sort of quite alternative. We're the crazy puppies of the bunch. You know, he said that it's not to say that there aren't traditional sort of very Catholic Brazilians in Berlin as well, but he said that they alone don't determine what it means to be Brazilian in Germany. He said this is much more sort of mixed idea, and it's sort of much more open. And so, as Geraldo said, you know, he didn't have to sort of go out with his gay friends and his straight friends if they were sort of going to sort of Brazilian community events, that they would sort of mix and they would sort of hang out together. And so in that sense, there was sort of there wasn't such a need for a sort of a separate queer and straight Brazilian communities, as we'll see would be the case with the Russian community. And so the Brazilian LGBT community did succeed in queering the Brazilian diaspora in line with the sort of the conceptualization of queer diaspora by Fortier. So they sort of found a queer space within the existing sort of Brazilian diaspora. Now, this wasn't the case with the Russians. And again, it sort of goes back to the nature of the Russian community. So the Russian community in Berlin was sort of very well established. There were a lot of sort of Russian sort of cafes and a lot of sort of cultural events. The embassy sort of put a lot of sort of effort into sort of promoting sort of Russian culture in Germany. But the Russian queers that I spoke to found that the diasporic spaces were either sort of unwelcoming if they found out you're LGBT, or they simply didn't like the form of representation of Russianness that was being sort of propagated. So Vladimir, for example, said he wouldn't go to sort of traditional Russian restaurants, at least not with sort of his boyfriend, because he sort of found he wasn't felt to sort of be sort of welcome, even though, the diaspora community conveys this idea that all Russians should sort of get on well together. Also, Boris sort of only ever attended one day of Russian culture, which was an annual event that was sort of organized by the sort of the local Russian community, combining sort of talks, films, art exhibitions. And he said that this was because of the behavior of the members of some of the ethno-cultural diaspora. As he said, sort of it was awful. It just reminds me of the Russia I left behind. Drunk, uncivilized people swearing, exactly what I wanted to escape from. So there was, that's a somewhat problematic statement for him to make, but nevertheless, this was the sort of the idea that I heard, that the Russians, the general Russian community in Berlin wasn't one that they necessarily wanted to sort of engage with. Even sort of when it was simply about sort of wanting to engage with Russian culture and not necessarily with sort of Russians as a sort of a group in Berlin, Daria, for example, sort of didn't like this sort of the very overly traditional representation of sort of Russian culture. So, for example, she would say that, what the embassy and Russia House do in terms of culture is so absolute. This is authentic Russian culture. It's true that there are Goethe institutes in other countries and they propagate German culture, but it's not just Goethe and Schiller, but it's much more varied. So again, the Russian queers I spoke to found that the sort of more alternative sort of queer inspired versions of Russian culture simply weren't represented. And so they felt that they weren't able to queer the Russian diaspora in the way that the Brazilians had queered the Brazilian diaspora. They couldn't find a space within the pre-existing diasporic community. And so what they did instead was to create their own sort of queer diaspora. And so they established a sort of a queer diasporic community called Kvartira. Kvartira in Russian means apartment. So it conveys the sort of the sense of home, but it's made up of the words queer and art, sort of reflecting the fact that sort of most of the people who set it up were sort of queer artists from Russia. So this sort of community, they sort of meet regularly. They sort of do maintain a sort of an ethno-linguistic boundary with the host society in the same way that sort of a traditional diaspora would. Everything was sort of carried out in Russian. I was allowed to sort of take part, but they said they wouldn't sort of switch out of Russian while I was there. I would need to sort of try and keep up. They offered the same sort of social, psychological, and economic support to members, which is what sort of traditional diasporas do as well. And there was a sort of a homeland orientation. So they sort of did sort of demonstrate a loyalty and solidarity to queers in Russia in a way that the sort of general diasporic communities would do with their homeland. So this is sort of just a sort of a brief snapshot of some of the ideas that I engaged with in my chapter. And so I would encourage you to go and download the whole thing and sort of read it in much more detail. So thank you. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Our next presenter is Keith Mcneal, who will take us to the Netherlands, and more specifically to queer, Caribbean and Muslim asylum seekers there. His chapter is entitled Between Homonationalism and Islamophobia. Keith is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Houston. And he's a cultural and historical anthropologist with specialization in Caribbean ethnology. Thank you very much. Heath.
Great, thanks. Hello to everyone. I'm really happy to be here and honored to be part of this project all along from the original conference in London some years ago to this really exciting collection. Coming from Houston, Texas, USA, located on the unceded lands of indigenous peoples known as the Sana, the Atakapa Ishak, Kowiltekan, Karankawa, and Akukisa. I want to say from the beginning that this project, this chapter is based on a collaboration between myself and Sarah French-Brennan, who I will talk about in a few minutes, but it's been a really rewarding experience to work with her, to collaborate and to learn from each other through a comparative methodology that really helped focus both of our respective pieces of work. So I'm going to comment about that as well. So the Netherlands, of course, as has already been alluded to several times in today's discussion, actually, the Netherlands is an interesting and important case study, given that it's seen by so many as the great national poster child for gay liberation, right? Everyone knows about Amsterdam, everyone knows about the Netherlands, more or less, right? So once we started the collaboration, we initially had two sets of questions. One was centered around the question of like, what's the relationship between the ideal and reality? How do, the Dutch, who might be liberal in terms of sexual and gender diversity and other liberal freedoms, how do they actually operate within their border? How do they operationalize themselves in terms of the border migration asylum apparatus, right? So if, Netherlands might be the archetype of homo-nationalism in terms of LGBT rights and general liberal freedoms, but does the Dutch state also walk the talk when it comes to queer and transgender asylum seekers seeking refuge from other countries, right? So that's one question. And then another initial question we had concerned questions of change. We were wondering if the Dutch border migration asylum apparatus was changing at all. If so, how? We were especially thinking about the European refugee crisis, which climaxed in 2015. I had started doing my fieldwork in the Netherlands, maybe 2014. So we were interested in questions of change over recent years, and if so, how? Has the Dutch border and migration system how has it been responding to the kind of wider Fortress Europe mentality that had been bolstered across the continent recently, within the last decade in relation to the refugee crisis, but also stretching back some decades with the rise of kind of like the Muslim other and Islamophobia within the politics and political cultures of EU member states. So, like I said, my collaborator is Sarah French-Brennan. She is a PhD. She got her PhD in anthropology from Columbia University in 2020. She's now teaching LGBT studies at Syracuse University. And she told me to share with everyone that she's super pregnant in the midst of a move. And she's very sorry that she couldn't swing this webinar, but she's very much here in spirit and definitely in my heart, because I'm really happy about our collaboration. We met, I think, in around 2014 at the University of Amsterdam's Summer Sexuality Studies Institute. It's very well known. It's a very prestigious, important, I think 4-week program. I was in the country and I ended up being a guest speaker. She was a participant. She was just beginning her field work on queer and trans asylum seeking from Muslim countries and among folks from the Middle East and a few from Eastern Africa, but mainly the Middle East, who were either Muslim or, coming from what was perceived as a dominant Muslim background. So we got to know each other. We continued the conversation. Our conversation kept deepening and then essentially grew into the collaboration represented by our chapter here. My own work on this topic grows out of being really an anthropologist and historian who works on Trinidad and Tobago on topics religious studies and some other dimensions of cultural history, but also I've been kind of slowly focusing over more recent years on a big project that I'm currently finishing, a historical ethnography of queer Trinidad and Tobago. About a decade ago, I started being solicited as a country expert for cases from TNT in the UK. So I've worked intermittently on a series of cases specifically from TNT to the UK. That was a very interesting experience for me. I had heard about and sort of knew some people who had taken that trajectory, but getting pulled in as a country expert and having access to the document bundles and all the kind of legal, technical, expert machinations of all the experts operating was extremely revealing, let's say. So I ended up doing work on the UK. I chased down people that I had worked on their cases after their cases ended, interviewing them, and I ended up doing some field work in the UK. And I published a paper on the British case in 2019, in which I'm quite critical of what I see as some pretty profound hypocrisies and contradiction within the British asylum system regarding SOGI asylum seeking. So that was where I was coming from when I then jumped, actually it was from like a month or two of field work in the UK that I went across to Amsterdam, not for the first time, but I passed through and I ended up through networks. I met a good friend who's here, actually shout out to Ashley in the attendees today, who became a good friend and really an important interlocutor for me. And then I began doing interviewing, some research and some field work in the Netherlands. And then I met Sarah and here we are, right? So our conversations began, just talking about, oh, what asylum camps have you spent time in? Where have you, because there's a very extensive asylum and refugee camp system throughout the Netherlands. It's a very complex and dynamic and very interesting sort of geography. In general, for refugees and asylum seeking in general, the question of like which camp you end up in, whether they have a whole house for queer and trans folk, whether or not that's even a good idea in the first place, like those kinds of issues. And we began talking about, the experiences of the folks that she knows and was tracking from Muslim backgrounds, and in my case, English-speaking Caribbean people. So let's see. Right, so our conversations evolved and we sort of realized that we started kind of unintendedly started working on a kind of comparative analysis in which bringing our two sort of methodological perspectives and approaches on the Dutch case were very interesting. On the one hand, it enabled us to get a better sense of like what's happening within the Dutch case, like as a whole, what kind of generalizations can be made and what kinds of changes or not are transpiring within the Dutch case. But it also, over time, we realized that putting English-speaking Caribbean experiences next to Middle Eastern Muslim experiences, we were able to start triangulating on questions of race, racism, the figure of the Muslim, the politics of Islamophobia, in ways that I don't think either one of us would have gotten quite as deep. So our comparative analysis itself kind of evolved through time. So I just want to basically talk about what we found once we put our the cases that we were tracking next to one another, and then make a few remarks about questions of race, racism, and the politics of Islamophobia in the Dutch case, which are very interesting and complex and in many ways very troubling. In an overall sense, in a general sense, we found that acceptance rates for asylum seekers in the Netherlands rose from 2010 to 2015 quite significantly, like more than 25%. At 2015, at the height of the European refugee crisis, I'm talking about overall asylum applications and like overall, not just SOGI claims based on SOGI experience or status, we found that acceptance rates overall in the Netherlands rose from 2010 to 2015, reached, and that was actually the apex of it. And then in the wake of the sort of climax of at the most manifest level, the European refugee crisis in 2015, then actually acceptance rates across the board started tapering back down again. And it seems like a sort of slow but general consistent trend. So in that sense, we can see a kind of the Dutch case in a sense being connected to and responding to the kind of machinations of Fortress Europe, the kind of backlash, xenophobia dynamic. However, we also found that in the Dutch case, in fact, the Dutch asylum system did nonetheless, throughout this kind of upswing and downswing over the past decade, that the Dutch system has generally maintained relatively higher rates of granting asylum based on SOGI claims compared with other European countries. So therefore, the picture that emerges is one of just another EU member state, right? But albeit one with quite robust homo-nationalist tendencies. So that's generally true across the board. But as we began sort of parsing the experiences of folks coming from queer and trans folk coming from the Caribbean, and those coming from Middle Eastern Muslim, majority Muslim backgrounds, a kind of deeper and more complex picture emerges. So what are we talking about here? So we're thinking about Caribbean people who come from a mostly a region that is understood in the dominant geopolitical imagination as a non-Muslim region, right? One that is also racialized as Black, largely racialized as Black. So we're thinking about folks coming from that sort of geopolitical space as compared with those coming from Muslim understood geopolitical space. So in terms of Caribbean, and specifically English-speaking Caribbean folk, I can't speak that authoritatively about others from the Caribbean, but most asylum seekers from the Caribbean are Black or mixed race. And it turns out, and again, it was interesting, like I wasn't even paying attention to this until my conversation with Sarah, until we started working together. And then I was kind of backtracking and revisiting my conversations with people and asking them again, finding out, well, actually their Caribbean folk are almost never asked about their religious identities, backgrounds, or practices. It's like a kind of moot thing. Religion is kind of moot for queer and trans asylum seekers coming from the Caribbean. Even Indo-Caribbean folks, so people of South Asian, Indian background, coming from places like Trinidad and Tobago or Guyana, for example, who in some cases are actually Muslim, but the fact that they're from the Caribbean, from a region that is not understood and figured, imagined as Muslim, it's like their Muslimness kind of doesn't matter in an interesting way because of the larger kind of racialization of geopolitics. So I found this was true to be the case with the people that I interviewed and the groups of people whose experience I am familiar with. However, the Caribbean, as many people know, is kind of imagined as this sort of like extra, homophobic, like, super homophobic, problematic space, right? So the general geopolitical imagination of the Caribbean is one of being a homophobic, Black, non-Muslim space, which it seems has kind of, in a sense, worked in the favor of queer and trans asylum seekers from the Anglophone Caribbean, because one, Islam is just moot. It's not a threat to be considered at all by the Dutch asylum system. And there's a way in which offering asylum to SOGI claimants from the Caribbean is a way of kind of ideologically bolstering Dutch homo-nationalist identity, right? Because it's like saying, oh, look how benevolent and wonderful we are. We're saving you from your homophobic backward society, right? So these were dynamics that I found to be operating within the cases of the trajectories of queer and trans Caribbean folks. Nonetheless, almost to a person, all of the Caribbean folks, the queer and trans Caribbean asylees that I know and have spoken to, have observed or been quite passionately have a lot to say about the racism that they've experienced in the Netherlands, almost to a T. All of them have experienced more racism than at home in the Caribbean. And many of them have found this both surprising and unexpected, therefore disappointing and very frustrating. So there's a lot of discourse about like, wow, I can come here and I can be me on one side, but now this thing that I didn't have to worry about as much in the Caribbean, in fact, now I'm just like, oh my God, these Dutch people are so racist. I know many people who have said exactly that, right? So, okay, so we have a complex constellation of factors happening on the Caribbean side. On the Muslim side, it's a kind of another story altogether because all of them are highly interrogated and sort of held to task for being from Muslim countries, even if they do not identify as Muslim or even practice Islam. So already they're sort of fighting an uphill ideological battle with regard to, you know, the politics of Islamophobia. So there's an interesting discourse that Sarah found with some of her interlocutors about them saying something along the lines of, gosh, you know, we went from the sexual closet to the religious closet, in a sense, paradoxically, right? So Caribbean folk are undergoing their own kind of paradoxical, ironic, unexpected kinds of experiences with one politics of race, whereas on the Middle Eastern side, the politics of Islamophobia are quite ascendant.
Could I ask you to wrap up in the next minute?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. Right. So we are not convinced that that queer and trans people from the Muslim Middle East are. It's hard to find out exactly for sure, but we don't have the impression that the acceptance rates for SOGI claimants from the Muslim Middle East are equivalent to those of Caribbean background. That's that's an impression. It's difficult to be very specific about it, but we do have a question about that, and we doubt that they are quite equivalent, right? So there's the politics of Islamophobia in that case would be operating within just the space, the relatively higher Dutch acceptance of SOGI asylum claiming, but as another kind of ideological buffer for Dutch homonationalism, once queer and trans people from Muslim backgrounds are accepted, it provides another different kind of ideological buffer for Dutch, saying like, no, look, you know, like defending against accusations of cultural racism against Muslims, saying, no, look, we're not Islamophobic, right? We're letting these, you know, we're saving these other people from their societies, but if we were Islamophobic, we wouldn't be letting Muslims in, something like that. It's a very rich and complex multidimensional comparative analysis that's difficult to fully characterize, but this is the kind of project that we were up to and the kind of findings that we discovered along the way.
Our final presentation is given by Tandem Maura Dustin and Nina Held on their chapter, which is entitled "They Sent Me to the Mountain, the Role of Space, Faith and Support Groups for LGBTIQ plus Asylum Claimants." Moira Dustin is a research fellow in the Department of Law in Sussex and a visiting fellow at the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the LSE, the London School of Economics. She was previously Director of Research and Communications at the Equality and Diversity Forum and also worked at the Refugee Council. Nina Held is a Research and Teaching Fellow in Sociology at the University of Sussex, and her research explores gender and sexuality, critical race and whiteness studies, sexual and emotional geographies, and LGBTIQ+ asylum and human rights. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start and then I'm going to hand over to Nina and we're going to kind of go back and forth, but we promise we won't run over time. And first of all, thank you very much to Richard for organising this event and for producing this fantastic book. Nina and I are both really pleased to have had the opportunity to contribute to it. And I'm really pleased to be that we're kind of last in the lineup and following what Keith said, because I think our presentation follows on quite well from that, and also makes me realise all the things that we could have, you know, that we could have explored in our research. And I'm thinking about the kind of the scope for analysing people's outcomes in the UK, depending on the region that they came from and the relationship between race and minority religious identities in decision making and outcomes. But you know, that's a whole other project. So I'm just going to introduce what we're going to say before handing over to Nina. We are, in our contribution, we wanted in our chapters of the book, we wanted to explore the social dimensions of SOGI asylum claims in Europe, but not only the way that affects people's individual experiences, but also the relationship between the social dimension and the legal dimension, because you know, our sense is that quite often these two elements are treated separately. But you know, our sense was, and the findings from our fieldwork were that the legal asylum process doesn't operate in isolation from the kinds of social phenomenon that we're going to be talking about today. So we used data from the SOGICA project, which was a 4-year project looking at the legal and social experiences of people claiming asylum in Europe. It was a European Research Council project, lasted 4 years, and I'm just going to very briefly say something about the project. The website has we've got a project website which has a load of information about it, which you can have a look at. That's the link to that is in our final slide if you want to know more. But it was basically it was a comparative piece of work, piece of research. It involved case studies of the UK, which is the jurisdiction that I led on, Germany, which is where Nina did her field work, and Italy, and we also looked at the EU and Council of Europe level. It was interdisciplinary, so socio-legal, which I think was a real benefit in terms of kind of adding to the richness of our findings, and I think that's another reason why it's really nice to have been contributing to this book, which also really benefited from the kind of interdisciplinary nature of its contributors and contributions. We were very keen that we would be focusing on the kind of the intersectionality of people's experiences, so the impact of gender, sexuality, race, class, religion, nationality, all of these elements coming together to determine both decision making and also the experiences of the people claiming asylum that we were talking to. we tried very hard to build ethical commitments into the project from the outset. So consulting our participants and supporting them in ways outside of the kind of the normal academic fieldwork process, setting up resources that we hoped would be beneficial to them in lots of ways. Again, there's more information about that on our website, and the whole project was very much informed by our kind of human rights, feminist and queer underpinnings. And just briefly on the methodology that underpins what we're going to go on to talk about in a minute, it was the usual kind of, a lot of the usual academic methodology, a really sort of mixed method approach. We had interviews with SOGI asylum claimants in the countries that we've talked about, Germany, the UK and Italy, but also policymakers, members of the judiciary, lawyers, the NGOs that work in these fields and other professionals. We carried out focus groups, had an online survey, and did lots of court observations in the countries that we studied, and freedom of information requests. Those are the basis for the kind of the findings that we're going to talk about very briefly today, in relation to the kind of, we've organised it around the kind of themes, if you like, of space, religion, and LGBTIQ+ support networks. And I'm going to hand over to Nina now, just to talk first about space.
Thank you, Maura. Yeah, so this section of the chapter looked at how spatial experience can affect the legal process or the legal outcome even of LGBTIQ+ claimants. And here we looked at the experiences in accommodation centers, but also their surroundings, and also detention centers. And some of the things that we wrote about in the chapter was, on one hand, the experiences in quite heteronormatively structured accommodation centers where LGBTIQ+ claimants often feel quite uncomfortable, can experience violence, verbal violence, physical violence. If they are out as LGBTQI, they might be afraid to be out or to be outed, often hiding their sexual orientation and gender identity in those accommodation centers. And here there were some differences between Germany, UK and Italy in terms of the shared accommodation. So in the UK, people are usually accommodated in shared accommodation. In Germany and Italy, this is even including shared bedrooms as a norm. And especially in Germany, there are accommodation centers where people share bedrooms with 2, 4, 8. I think the maximum that I heard in the interviews was sharing a bedroom with 7 other people. So obviously there's a lack of privacy, and it's very difficult for LGBTQI claimants. And in terms of this effect on the legal process, here we heard some accounts where people were telling us how this is a quite intimidating experience, and you have to hide your sexual orientation and gender identity. And then on the other hand, when you go to the asylum interview, it's expected from you that you're quite open and talk about your sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is even exacerbated by often being put into very rural areas. And this again was especially the case in Germany. And there you can see the quote, "They sent me to the mountain," which is part of our title. It was actually taken from one of the participants, a trans man who said that, who felt they had sent him to the mountain in a very rural area. And so on top of experiencing perhaps homophobic, transphobic violence within the accommodation centers, homophobic, transphobic violence, or transphobia, racism outside the accommodation center. So as Keith just also said, they are in those rural areas where they can't access any LGBTIQ plus support, and that just kind of adds up to this intersectional experience where it's very difficult then to open up when they are in the interview. So Winifred here said, but the reason I don't express my sexual orientation is that you sent me into the village. The moment I reached here, I couldn't express myself because of the environment I was in. I didn't know anyone. So her claim was refused, and some explanation for the refusal was that she didn't really talk much about her sexual orientation. And as she said, kind of like, how should I, if you put me into this environment, how can I? And another participant, Nana, spoke about, gathering evidence, I don't know, having relationships, finding a partner, which is often also part of the claim. To have a successful claim, you have to provide evidence of relationships. And, this, again, kind of assumption that when you come from these really horrible countries, and then once you come to Europe and you are safe, you will just basically, the first thing you can think about is like, getting a partner. And she said, we can't go to parties because, like me in the interview, they say I have to look for a girlfriend. Every time I go to look for a girlfriend when I'm in the village, how am I going to do that? So again, difficulties in terms of how LGBTIQ plus claimants experience those spaces and not being able to go to groups and perhaps find a partner, but then also the impact on the legal process in terms of finding it difficult to express yourself and also finding it difficult to gather evidence for your claim. And a couple of other things I just want to quickly mention that was also important to look at. If claimants are accommodated in these rural areas, it's also often difficult, obviously, to find a solicitor that has expertise in LGBTIQ plus claims. So then that obviously will also impact negatively on the claim. And as I said before, we also looked at the experiences in detention centers. And I hope you read the chapter. There are very difficult experiences in detention centers. 9 of our participants in the UK had experience in detention centers where, again, they're just very horrible spaces in general, but for LGBTIQ plus claimants in particular, difficult. And again, in terms of gathering evidence, contacting a solicitor from the detention center while you are afraid that somebody will find out about your sexual orientation and gender identity is very difficult and can then impact negatively on the claim. So these were kind of the results in that section that we discussed. And then Maura, I think you were talking about religion, aren't you?
Yes, so I'm just going to say something briefly about religion, where the same kind of tensions and kind of contradictions can also be seen. I mean, obviously, Soji persecution is often legitimised on religious grounds, and that's formally recognised. But despite that, we found in our findings, which I think is something that that is is starting to be recognised, that religious affiliation or religious upbringing is often deployed against claimants when they're making their claim. So there's a belief on the part of decision makers, both in the first instance and on appeal in the countries that we looked at, a very simplistic belief that when people are kind of fleeing persecution, they, in order to be recognised as genuine, claimants must either renounce their faith or they need to show that they struggle to reconcile a religious identity with a sexuality, with a minority sexuality or gender identity. So I've given some examples on this slide, which I'm not going to go through in detail, but for example, just one example, Jane, one of our interviewees in the UK, was asked, these are all pseudonyms by the way, probably goes without saying, was asked how she reconciled her religion with her sexuality. She said she was a Catholic, and she said, yes, I'm a Catholic, and I'm a lesbian bisexual orientation, and I don't need to reconcile anything with anything there. And the Home Office didn't find that a very convincing response, and her initial application was refused, and that was a contributing factor. And this line of argument actually breaches Home Office guidance, but it wasn't an isolated experience. So there's a really kind of unsophisticated approach to religious identities on the part of many decision makers. But then at the same time, we should also recognise, and again, this was something that we found, that the persecution that people experienced on the basis that's justified on religious grounds in their country of origin would often be repeated in the European country in which they arrived. So, and it's not only a question of experiencing religion, but the kind of the chill effect, if you like, the perception that kind of refugee and migrant community organisations are going to be, as disapproving of homosexuality and non-conformism on sexual and gender identity grounds in the host country as those communities are in the country of origin, and that would lead to situations where people would not live openly because they wanted to experience the community support of whatever community organisation existed in the in the host country, in the country of claiming asylum, which would mean then that they would not not have accumulated the kinds of evidence of being LGBTIQ+ that decision makers would want to see to grant them refugee status. So there'd be this awful kind of circular process going on, that was definitely something that we came across. And then lastly, the thing that I think perhaps more in the UK than in the other countries that we looked at, despite these very negative experiences, many people, retained very strong religious affiliations. And had sought out LGBTIQ+ friendly churches, and were finding religion to be a real sense of support. And such non-discriminatory and identity affirming religious organisations provided a lot of practical support. So, people, I saw lots of the people that I interviewed, particularly in Manchester and Birmingham, and some of the kind of cities where there are lots of LGBTIQ people claiming asylum and support groups organised around them. A lot of the time those support groups would have a kind of a gay-friendly faith identity. There's a group in Manchester called the First Wednesday Group that's sort of got 60+ people meeting on the first Wednesday of every month, hence its name, providing a huge amount of support to asylum claimants, and to the extent that. Yeah. Can
I ask you to come to an end? So
So just to say that on that front, religion is a very kind of complicated source of both kind of persecution, perceived persecution, support, and it's all rather complicated. I'll pass back to Nina now.
Okay, I just very quickly say something about LGBTIQ+ support and the importance. I hope you're going to read the chapter because we're running out of time. But yeah, that was just, you know, we write about how invaluable the support from LGBTIQ plus support groups is for claimants to really navigate the process, to know what evidence they need to provide. Groups also help providing evidence, and just to be able to also, you know, talk in the interview about their sexual orientation, gender identity. Often these groups help people to even realize that they can claim asylum on such grounds. So yeah, we just really make a strong claim to recognize the support that LGBTIQ plus groups give in the process as something that's just really invaluable for the claims and often for positive outcome of the claims.
Yes.